Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. What a qualifying session at the Hungarian Grand Prix. If there was ever any doubt which is the new car to beat in Formula 1 today, potentially answer those questions. A front row lockout for McLaren. Max Verstappen not especially happy about it. George Russell with an absolute disaster class in Mercedes, but the same is true for Sergio Perez as well. Again, crashing out in Q1. The Red Bull pit wall not at all happy. So many storylines to dive into today. Very much interested your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. Lots of things happening before the day got underway as well about Ferrari, some talk about concerns on their long run pace. It was a bit of a redemption for Ferrari this weekend to some degree. They were still quite a way off where they needed to be to really challenge for pole position, however. They did end up sandwiching Lewis Hamilton at the end of the qualifying session. And Leclerc crashed yesterday in free practice too, but the general feeling was okay. The car's okay. They've made a step forward in drivability with the new floor. The updates are relatively satisfactory. But, compared to where the McLaren is, it still leaves rather a lot to be desired right now. There was also these very interesting statements from George Russell on Hamilton's move to Ferrari. He was asked the question, if Hamilton had known where they would be now, or let's say where they would be post-Silverstone, because today was not a good day at all, would Hamilton have left a Ferrari? And Russell actually says, I think Hamilton would disagree with this, I genuinely think Hamilton does disagree with this, but also he's obviously going to say that publicly, right, because he's joining Ferrari if he ever wants to speak on this. But Russell says, I don't think he would have left if the team was performing like this. No way he would have left, for sure not. And I don't know what you guys think about this. As I've said before, I think for Hamilton it was not even just about the on-track stuff, it was also about the off-track stuff, whether they wanted him long-term, the ambassadorial stuff, and, the idea of driving for Ferrari. I think there are a few factors in play, but, there's an argument to say that our Ferrari in a great position compared to Mercedes, but then again today, after all the talk from Mercedes over the last couple of weeks, we're bringing these upgrades to Hungary, that's the race we think we're going to be able to win and all this. Where was their pace today? It was okay, it was there or thereabouts for a time, but then again, you go to Q3, half a second off the pace. So it's not like Mercedes all of a sudden have a world-beating car, maybe it just works well at particular circuits. This I thought would be one of them, but that was not the case today. Obviously Russell also talks about 2026, the power unit coming along well. Says everyone wants change at some point, but yeah, his feeling is that you want to be in the fastest car, he should have stayed where he is, but I'm not sure you will feel the same after today, but we've got to talk about this qualifying session. We'll do quickly on practice first, but this quote from Helmut Marko, right, because we saw this quote from Perez yesterday, who said, don't know why these guys keep talking about my future, right? I've got a contract. I'm going to fulfill the contract. It's yeah, I don't know about that one, son, because Helmut Marko says, ultimately, it doesn't matter what your contract looks like, you just have to deliver, and what he did deliver today was a crash into the wall. Now, he's got the older version of the car before the upgrades that were designed for circuits such as this, that Verstappen has, but it's still a Red Bull at the end of the day, and it was still a car that was absolutely dominating right back at the start of the season, but that is certainly not the case anymore. In the last 6 Grand Prix, Verstappen has now had pole on one of those occasions, whereas I think in the first 7 Grand Prix of the season, he was on pole every single time, wasn't he? Which was remarkable, but that's now changed rather quickly indeed. Practice was pretty interesting because, the McLaren was quick, the Mercedes looked okay as well, the Red Bull was there or thereabouts. The Mercedes, though, was looking a bit trickier to drive. Hamilton, towards the end of the practice session, had a spin towards the end of the second sector, but it was the McLarens that were looking like the world beaters, right? Norris put in a rapid time in the part of practice, and Verstappen put in a pretty good time, but then locked up on his kind of final attempt on the final lap, so kind of shows that Red Bull was not exactly where he would like it to be. This, of course, is down at turn 1, and I will say just quickly on the McLaren, they've put this slightly new onboard camera view here, with it seems to be slightly lower, and gives you a much better sense of speed. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the fact that the T-cam is positioned in such a way to maximize the view of the sponsors, really. That's what it's there for. It's not there to show the speed, it's there to show the sponsors. But this camera angle shows the sponsors and gives you the real sense of speed, which I think is fantastic, right? And is good for the sport in general. Even Domenicali has talked about this, kind of CEO of Formula 1, that what he's hoping for is to bring the noise back over the coming years and bring in the sense of speed back on camera as well as a big point. If you watch some of these older Grand Prix from, let's say, the mid-2000s, the cars look so much faster, even though they're slower than today's cars. And it's mainly because of the way the cameras are deployed, not even talking about onboard stuff, but just the way the cameras follow the cars around the track. it's very close to the cars, they're very zoomed in, whereas you really get the sense of speed when you get a slightly more zoomed out version, can get to see more how they're moving through this scenery at a ridiculous rate of knots. But the issue is that the cameras like the close-ups because you get to see the sponsors, and it is what it is in Formula 1. But at the end of practice, we had Verstappen P3, Piastri P2, Norris P1, and this is rather familiar as we're going to discuss over the coming minutes here. But as we get into qualifying, it was tricky conditions. It was kind of, there was damp in the air, there was rain on the track, it was kind of raining and spitting, but then it wasn't all of a sudden, and it was kind of difficult to tell how much grip the track was really going to have. Hamilton put in a pretty good lap early on, a 17.0 I think it was, which was not as fast at all as they were going in free practice, but given the conditions was good enough. And at this time, given it was, medium grip to high grip conditions, DRS was still enabled, but they then disabled it, which made things rather more challenging for some of the other drivers. But, for Sergio Perez, it seems everything is a challenge at the moment, right? Because coming out of the chicane into turn 8, Perez dips a wheel basically onto the curb on the right-hand side. It's a bit too slippy to take it as he tries to turn in, loses the rear ends, and out he goes. And how many times are we going to see this, right? We talk quite often, actually, on this channel about the Logan Sargent versus Sergio Perez qualifying battle. After today, Sargent and Perez are now tied in qualifying this season. So I'm pretty sure that's true. I'll just say it again anyway, because I'm pretty sure it's true. Sargent and Perez are tied on qualifying this year, and Sargent put in a good lap 1 today. I think deserves credit, and there was a feeling that maybe Williams could have made Q3 if they'd have really got their act together at the end of the second part of qualifying. But yeah, this is Sergio Perez under enormous amounts of pressure, it's got to be said, coming into this weekend to at least do something respectable, right? We saw that Jenson Button the other day said that if Perez doesn't score, he thinks they've got to axe him, and he's going to have a hard time scoring from where he's going to start this Grand Prix, because qualifying is important around here in Hungary, overtaking is challenging. He comes out of the chicane, and basically as he turns left into this fast left-hander, he just has 2 of his right-hand side wheels on the curb on the right-hand side on the white line. And when it's a little bit damp, a little bit rainy, a little bit tricky, that's enough to lose the car. And out he goes, crashes out of the session. Relatively big impact. Glad that he's okay, of course. But yeah, this was the immediate reaction from the Red Bull pit wall. If there was one time to crash, it wasn't this time. And to be fair, last year in Hungary, he was under pressure and he put it in the wall in practice. This time, though, in qualifying, when it really matters, this is Christian Horner. This is Giampiero Lambiase, this is Pierre Wache, this is Christian Horner. This, of course, is Hannah Schmitz, the Red Bull strategist, and they're all looking at Perez. And at this point, he was actually P9. So it's not like he was fast, he wasn't. But he was fast enough to be kind of safe. But after this crash, all of a sudden, there was opportunities for improvements, right? So this is, as incredible as it sounds, the recent qualifying results for Perez. Imola P11, Monaco P16, Canada P16, then a couple of P8s in a row, which is, wow, congratulations, you made Q3. P19, of course, in Silverstone, and then, he crashed out there last time, and then crashes out in Q1 again here at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and ends up P16, I believe, in the end for tomorrow's race. The other problem that they had, though, in this session was from Mercedes. The team that George Russell was like, yeah, no way Lewis should lead this team. We're the best type thing. We're back on top. But no, clearly still some problems here. Russell didn't do as good of a job as he needed to on his first runs when Hamilton was P1. Russell didn't really put the laps together in those tricky conditions, so he left himself with a bit of work to do. But at the end of the session, the times were getting faster and faster. The track was drying up fast. And Russell put in a good lap. It was good enough. And then his final lap would have definitely been good enough to get through to the final part of, or the next part of qualifying, because Ricciardo put a time in that was good enough for P1. But the problem was for Russell is that he ends up out of qualifying because he puts in a lap time which was about a second off, 9/10 off where Hamilton was. But the track was far quicker on the final run. The issue is for Mercedes, they didn't put enough fuel in the car. And this is, a fundamental error. Russell said it's basically embarrassing. It's a fundamental problem. I can't believe how we didn't do this. And it seems pretty straightforward, right? You would think for Mercedes to say, okay, the track's going to get faster and faster, right? Everyone's going to be driving on the track. All you've got to do is make sure you've got enough fuel for him to run to the end of the race. He's got to do 3 laps of fuel. The difference in those type of conditions between the extra fuel load giving you a very small advantage because the car is lighter, and the difference in the track conditions is night and day, right? It's like, 1 extra lap of fuel in the car is not going to make any difference really when it comes down to actually getting out there on track on a drier circuit. And that's the problem that Russell ran into. So absolutely shocking from Mercedes, and Russell goes out in Q1, the man that was on pole position here 2 years ago, and in a far weaker Mercedes potentially than what they technically are meant to have at the moment. He's out of there, as is Sergio Perez, but of course Max Verstappen continues on. So he puts a good lap in at the start of Q2. As to be fair to the Aston Martins, I think definitely worth talking about Aston briefly, because yesterday all the talk was that these guys were screwed. Their upgrades weren't working, they didn't know what was going on, but they've definitely done a better job dialing them in, and both Stroll and Alonso were able to put on at least respectable lap times to get back to some degree of competitiveness, right? The times today, by the way, were so fast compared to last year. Hamilton, of course, was on pole here last year, but the track conditions, cooler, and just meant that there was so much grip on the track. Like, this year's pole time was well over a second faster than last year's pole time. There were so many drivers who would have had pole if there'd have been, if this year's qualifying time set last year's pole position, that have all had it basically. And Lewis Hamilton was very lucky to get through really to Q3. He was struggling for grip on the final run. He obviously talked about himself being struggling in that moment, but also Mercedes. And just again, a bit of a consistent trend here for Mercedes, right? Like, we thought that maybe they'd solve this issue, but at the start of the year, their bane of their existence was doing well in practice, good at the first part of qualifying, but when it comes to Q2, Q3, all of a sudden it's not quite working anymore. And we've basically seen that here again today, when it comes to Q3, the Mercedes really was nowhere near the actual pace. But both RBs, they made it through as well. So, you gotta think, right, if you're Sergio Perez, I mean, what a time to do it. Verstappen obviously made it, as did Yuki and Ricciardo. Now, Yuki then binned it in the wall a second later, because Max Verstappen said yesterday, right, about the upgrades, the fact that these upgrade packages, it needed to work, right? They needed to deliver with this package, otherwise they don't really know where they're going to be for the rest of the season. It's not like he was slow, but he just wasn't quite fast enough. He put in a very strong competitive lap time just before the rain was due to come out, but instead of him getting pole position, Lando Norris absolutely destroyed it. And I think this is where you come to see Piastri made a mistake, by the way, in his first run, and was obviously much faster on his second run, but Norris just put in a 1:15.2, which was only just over a second off the time that the W11 did. So, there's talk that in this era of regulations, the team that's got closest to the W11 in terms of absolutely utmost performance, because every year the cars have got faster, and this year is the fastest set of cars we've had in this cycle of regulations, McLaren are the fastest car right now. Like, that seems to be true. It seems true on average over the last few races, and when Norris puts in a lap 3/10 clear of Max, even with not a great Sector 1, really, like, he was down on Max in Sector 1, but still puts in a clean, like an incredible Sector 2 and Sector 3 to go a third of a second clear of Max. I mean, that is not easily done, and he didn't even get to do a second run, as we'll see in a second, and still this was good enough for pole. So then the second runs are coming through. Piastri puts in a time P2 just behind Norris, and Verstappen ends up P3 in the end. Really close to like half a tenth to Norris in the end, but not good enough. Basically everything else kind of stayed the same here, apart from Sainz putting in a better lap time. But then, just as Norris was going to start his second attempt, Yuki puts it in the wall. This was out of the slow turn 5, just coming up to the chicane, goes a bit wide. Not sure if anything happened with the car. I think he just probably drifted a bit, and then all of a sudden he was bounced up by the curb and he was into the barriers. I'm glad that he was okay. Big contact there. Good news for Ricciardo, really, right? Because on a day that Perez and Tsunoda both crashed out of quali, Ricciardo has a pretty good job and ends up P9. But in the end, it was quite clear that even when this was going to restart, they probably weren't going to go anywhere with it, and that's what ends up happening. Verstappen gets out of the car, and he seemed frustrated, Verstappen. I don't think it was necessarily because they weren't putting it back in. I think Red Bull kind of knew that the rain's going to come down. We've only got an old set of tyres anyway. Like, there's no way Verstappen's going to improve on that, because that was basically as good as he could have done the previous attempt. So effectively, that was Red Bull settling for third place, which is not something you often see them do. And I think just the concept of that for Max was quite hurtful, really, and he seemed rather frustrated about it. And I think even his post-race interview, he kind of seemed a bit more downbeat than we usually expect, because I think he's now finally recognised that, the dominance they had is no longer there. He's going to have to try really hard to win the race tomorrow, which he's not going to be favoured to do anyway. The McLarens should win and convert, certainly around Hungary. And this is Max here, actually, just as he crossed the line. I mean, you can see how he basically punches the steering wheel here. Like, he's obviously not punching in joy and celebration, is he, right? Like, he's obviously not on pole. So, clearly some frustration as he crossed the line here about just the fact that the car isn't quite quick enough right now. And, like, he's not been used to this. The interviewers keep asking him the questions about it, and I'm sure he's kind of getting annoyed about it at this point. I think this is what exacerbated Verstappen's frustration, actually, as well. So clearly he just wasn't happy in general, but also, again, in his final corner, second last corner at least, Norris was there, right, trying to do his final run. Now, you can debate as to whether that was intentional from Lando, whether that was intentional from McLaren to have him in that position, or whether it was just, bad execution from Red Bull in terms of getting it right. Difficult to say, of course, how much this actually would have impeded Max, even if it didn't, impede him very clearly in terms of, in the corner, from a mentality perspective. When you see the car there, it is always going to slow you down to some degree. So probably part of the frustration there as well for Max. But it's quite clear that Red Bull are not where they previously were, and Max Verstappen, despite being very close to pole, it ain't enough. But, talking about Mercedes as well, where were they today, really? Hamilton ends up 6/10 off the pole time, and Russell was out in Q1. And even the Ferraris, after their progress, they were still, half a second each off the pace. So tricky conditions today, but still, the McLarens, what a performance from them. And Max has a lot to think about, I think, from now until the end of the season, as to be fair to Red Bull, given, the situation with Sergio Perez. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.